Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sipho Ngwema, Head of Communication here at the Competition Commission. For you today, you have Chairperson of the Fresh Produce Market Inquiry, Mr. Haden Rachisusu. On his left, you have got Advocate Rowan Mare, who is a leader of the technical team. And on the other side, you have got Mohau Pane, who's also a member of the team. We don't intend to keep you that long today. We have a very short program. And in terms of the program, we are going to take you through the provisional report of the Fresh Produce Market Inquiry. As you know that we have been doing an inquiry, or we are doing an inquiry into the fresh produce. And now, after a number of hearings and interactions with stakeholders in the industry, and I know that some of them you did attend those public hearings. And therefore, we have now reached this stage of that inquiry where the chairperson is now going to lead us into what is entailed into the report. Thereafter, we are going to have question and answers. And hopefully then at the end of that, we are going to be able to conclude the proceedings. So therefore, we are also trying to make sure that as soon as we are done and all the formalities have been done, these reports will be available on our website, but also will be distributed electronically to members of the media and stakeholders here, and also those who are joining us with live streaming. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let me now hand over to the chairperson of the inquiry to make his remarks, give us an overview of what is entailed in the report. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Sipho. And thanks to the stakeholders present today, including mainly the media. I know that we are also streaming this event live on our YouTube channel. So welcome to everyone following us here today. As you know, the Competition Commission of South Africa initiated the Fresh Produce Market Inquiry in terms of the Competition Act 89 of 1998. The Commission had reason to believe that there may be features in the fresh produce market that could impede, restrict, or distort competition, with specific focus on significant fresh produce. The main purpose of the inquiry is therefore to examine whether any features in the fresh produce value chain impede, restrict, or distort competition in the market. In terms of scope, the inquiry is focused on 5 fruits, namely apples, citrus, bananas, pears, and table grapes, and 6 vegetables, namely potatoes, onions, carrots, cabbage, tomatoes, and spinach. Prior to the commencement of the inquiry, the Commission had extensive consultations with stakeholders on the scope of the inquiry through the publication of the draft terms of reference and subsequent engagements. The inquiry received comments from 9 stakeholders, being industry associations, some processors, civil society, and other organizations, as well as wholesalers, aggregators, and other stakeholders. The inquiry further engaged 15 stakeholders across the value chain. These stakeholders included government departments, retailers, legislated organizations or regulators, as well as other industry bodies. The inquiry collected information and evidence through various methods. The inquiry published statement of issues, outlining some of the key issues for consideration by the inquiry on the Commission's website, and also invited stakeholders to comment. In addition, the inquiry sent out requests for information to more stakeholders across the fresh produce value chain. The inquiry held workshops with smaller or smallholder farmers in various locations in South Africa, namely Thohoyandou, Tzaneen, and Giyani in Limpopo, East Kamahook in the Eastern Cape Province, Tugela Ferry in KwaZulu-Natal Province, and Vredendal in the Western Cape Province. Prior to finalizing this provisional report, the inquiry also engaged most stakeholders that are affected by the provisional findings, recommendations, and remedial actions. These stakeholders, amongst others, include the retailers, national fresh produce market agents, or national fresh produce markets, market agents, as well as banking groups. The inquiry assessed the fresh produce value chain from input level to retail and wholesale. In doing so, the inquiry sought to identify any market features or a combination of features that may distort, restrict, or prevent competition in various markets along the fresh produce value chain. The inquiry also assessed the level and extent of SME and HDP participation in various markets. The market size of the domestic fresh produce market in South Africa is currently estimated at over 53 billion rands annually. So of that, about 21 billion, is sold through fresh produce, the national fresh produce markets, and about 32 billion through formal retail. This figure excludes exports, direct sales, and farm gate sales. Starting with the wholesale, the inquiry found that the state of the national fresh produce market infrastructure is in a concerning state. The inquiry's assessment of output markets for farmers revealed various concerns relating to retail as well as wholesale level. The inquiry also found that although national fresh produce markets generate enough revenue to sustain themselves, profits generated are not ring-fenced to cater for current and future capital expenditures. Although these assessments were mainly for top 4 national fresh produce markets, namely Johannesburg, Cape Town, Tshwane, and Durban, these problems are prevalent at all NFPMs. The inquiry also found inconsistencies in the NFPM's bylaws, so those bylaws that are applicable to NFPMs. This is a particular concern, especially for smallholder and SME or HDP farmers, who may be required to comply with different set of rules across various NFPMs. A difference in trading hours, for example, may imply that certain farmers are not able to access their ideal markets and be forced to sell through markets closer to them. These, therefore, may lead to distorted competition between farmers. The inquiry also found that SME farmers, particularly HDP farmers, find it difficult to sell their produce in the national fresh produce markets, despite being the least costly route to market. It has been estimated that less than 1% of gross value of sales in national fresh produce markets come from smallholder or SME farmers. The HDP or SME market agents also find it difficult to enter and grow in the NFPM space. Where entry occurs, this is limited and survival rate is low. The FPMI or the inquiry also found high levels of concentration with respect to the market for market agencies operating at the national fresh produce markets. Related to this, there is a concern on structural linkages between market agents. This structural linkage has an effect of chilling competition between market agencies in a highly concentrated market, regardless of the measure of concentration employed. Some questionable practices of the market agents were also uncovered. These practices have the likely effect of distorting market outcomes where they are practiced. In order to resolve instances of practices such as stock reversation and credit sales, industry regulators, together with NFPMs, need to play an active oversight role. The inquiry also found, raised a concern with the composition of the APEC Council in relation to the fresh produce representatives. Now I turn to the retail market. In relation to retail prices for fresh produce under consideration, the inquiry found some instances of high markups. High markups that retailers are able to sustain over a period of time could be a good indicator of lack of competition. Following preliminary engagements with retailers, the inquiry is continuing to analyze the data, and further engagements with these retailers will take place after the publication of this provisional report. This is mainly because the retailers concerned raised some issues with the data that was analyzed. So this is the data that was provided by the concerned retailers. But for due process, the inquiry has resolved that these retailers will have to be engaged even following the publication of this report. The inquiry also found that since the grocery retail market inquiry and following the disbandment of exclusive leases, there have not been new entry to challenge the top 4 retailers in shopping centers. The inquiry confirmed the structure of the retail landscape, especially in relation to national supermarket chains, has not changed. The major retailers account for a substantial share of the national grocery retail market. The inquiry further found that prices of fresh produce are not transparent enough such that they allow for consumers to reasonably compare prices in store and across retailers. This is because pricing of fresh produce is not on a per kg basis, but per unit basis. Lastly, there is still a slow progress in integrating SMEs, particularly those owned by HDPs, into various retailers' supply chains. In relation to the input level of the value chain, the inquiry assessed markets for fertilizers, agrochemicals, and seeds. In essence, South Africa relies extensively on imports of these key produce. This makes the agricultural sector in South Africa exposed to global risks. This has been observed during the COVID-19 period, as well as the events in Ukraine. The agrochemical sector in South Africa is moderately concentrated with various domestic and global players. However, the inquiry found that the majority of active ingredients are imported from abroad. Similar to fertilizer, the domestic farming sector is exposed to developments elsewhere as well as currency risks. Nonetheless, the inquiry found that some firms in the sector engage in practices or conduct that may distort competition. This centers mostly around the use of territorial allocation in their distribution agreements with retailers. In the seeds industry, the inquiry found instances where a firm appears to be involved in charging farmers what could be characterized as exploitative prices. The inquiry noted that price increases for certain seeds where this firm has very high market shares have been sustained over a period of time. In addition, access issues have also been uncovered in relation to seed potatoes or potato seeds. This problem relates to early termination of seed variety before expiry of its plant breeder's rights to ensure that competitors do not get hold of it after expiring. Linked to this is the challenge where the Agricultural Research Council is facing funding challenges following withdrawal of some industry associations who previously played a key role in funding the organization, particularly with a potato gene bank. As such, the defunding of the ARC by various industry associations has wider implications. And lastly, on barriers to entry, the inquiry has found quite high barriers to entry in the value chain. Access to finance remains one of the most important elements to successfully participate in farming. However, the inquiry found the interdependence between access to finance and access to water. This mainly because from the banks that appeared before the inquiry, they have indicated that the main reason for not allocating finance is the lack of water rights by the small-scale farmers. In order to alleviate these concerns or address these concerns, the inquiry has identified 29 practical and reasonable actions, being 8 remedial actions and 21 recommendations that could address distortions in the fresh produce market. On the national fresh produce market, the inquiry found that the state of the national fresh produce market's infrastructure, as widely reported, is deteriorating, and problems associated with maintenance of these key public goods are prevalent. The inquiry also found that although NFPMs generate enough revenue to sustain themselves, profits generated are not ring-fenced to cater for current and future capital expenditure. Although this assessment was mainly based on the top 4 markets, these problems are prevalent across all NFPMs. Now, the provisional recommendations to address this are as follows. 1, municipalities, in collaboration with SALGA, should change the operating and governance models for NFPMs and adopt the following in line with the municipal legislative framework, including Municipal Finance Management Act and Municipal Systems Act. These are the 2 options. The corporatization of national fresh produce markets operations through a state-owned corporation owned by municipalities, with particular emphasis on the need for accounting separation, i.e., a separate budget, procurement lines, and accountability through a stable board of directors, or the creation of public-private partnerships with municipalities retaining ownership of the NFPM's infrastructure. 2, the municipalities should ring-fence profits earned from the market to fund capital expenditure and, where feasible, increase budget allocations for NFPMs over and above the revenue generated by the NFPMs. The inquiry also provisionally found that HDP or small-scale farmers find it difficult to sell their produce in the national fresh produce markets, despite them being the least cost route to the markets. It has been estimated that less than 1% of gross value of sales in the national fresh produce markets come from smallholder or HDP or SME farmers and market agents. A provisional recommendation to address this is as follows. All NFPMs to set targets to increase annual sales of small-scale and HDP farmers through NFPMs. These targets should be a minimum of 10% increase annually in sales from SME and HDP farmers combined. As I've said before, the inquiry also found inconsistencies in the bylaws applicable to these markets. So the recommendation that deals with this particular issue is as follows. municipalities should, within 3 years, harmonize the bylaws with respect to trading hours, passing of risk from farmer to buyer, market agent rules, use of cold storage and ripening facilities, dispute resolution and appeal processes, and rules around conflict of interest in respect of NFPMs. In addition, SALGA, local municipalities, and all NFPMs should, following harmonization, revise bylaws every 3 years to keep up with the developments in the economy. The inquiry further found that HDP and market agents do not have access to the mostly traded fresh produce in the NFPMs. In this regard, the inquiry recommends measures to ensure access to the fresh produce. And there are recommendations to this effect. National fresh produce markets must put in place a program for the introduction of new HDP market agents where there is none, and ensuring that the HDP market agents have access to highly traded produce, namely potatoes, onions, tomatoes, and bananas at all NFPMs. Another recommendation that seeks to address this issue is large established farmers must put in place a program for the introduction of new HDP market agents where there is none, and ensuring that HDP market agents have access to highly traded produce, namely potatoes, onions, tomatoes, and bananas at all national fresh produce markets. The regulator, in this case IPAC, must develop a quantifiable HDP salesperson development program to develop skills and contribute to the successful new entry of HDP market agencies. Priority must be given to the existing salespersons from market agencies that are wholly owned by HDPs. Another recommendation, dominant market agents by either product line or overall market share per major national fresh produce market. So we have identified these, namely RSA Group, Subtropical, Grow Group, DEPA, and Prinsloo and Fender market agents must enter into management agreements with SME or HDP market agents for skills transfer as well as training on managing the fresh produce market agency business. The last recommendation to deal with this issue, so DALRAD must within 3 years amend the APA Act to confer powers to APAC to regulate market agencies' HDP ownership and participation. This should be in line with the Agri-BEE broad-based black empowerment framework for agriculture. Now turn to market agents. The FPMI, or the inquiry, also found high levels of concentration with respect to the market for market agencies operating at NFPMs. Related to this, there are concerning structural linkages between African Rainbow Capital, Subtropical, and RSA Group. These structural linkages have an effect of chilling competition between Subtropical and RSA Group. These are by far the largest market agencies in South Africa. The inquiry also found that smallholder HDP farmers could still face relatively high commission fees when engaging market agents. We have recommendations to address this. One, DALRAT should amend the APA Act within 3 years to allow for regulating the maximum commission fee which may be charged by market agents. That is, place an effective cap on commission fees, such that the revised cap should not lead into increases in the current commission fees and should provide for discounts. In addition, the costs associated with transport, palletizing, and packaging should be negotiated or set outside of the commission fee structure. APAC and the NFPM's management must use advocacy measures to educate farmers that they can negotiate lower commissions with market agents, and either that a maximum fee applies or that they cannot be forced to accept an ostensible standard commission rate. We have a provisional remedial action to address the cross-shareholding issue. African Rainbow Capital should divest its shareholding in either Subtropical or RSA Group. The buyer of divested shares must be a firm wholly owned or controlled by HDPs. This is to ensure that such a transaction does not dilute the current levels of black ownership in these businesses. Some practices of the market agents were also uncovered. These practices include stock reservation agents having possession of buying cards, after hours trading, and credit sales. These practices have the likely effect of distorting market outcomes where they are practiced. We have a recommendation for this. APEC must develop and enforce a code of good practice governing these practices in accordance with the relevant provisions of APA Act for market authorities and market agents to comply with. The inquiry found conflict of interest in the composition of APEC Council in relation to the fresh produce representatives. This may imply that the registrar of APEC may not be able to exercise his or her duties for disciplining market agencies if found to be engaged in undesirable practices, as he or she reports to a council that the same market agents are appointed to. The inquiry makes a provisional finding that the composition of APEC, insofar as fresh produce members are concerned, creates a conflict of interest by having market participants exercise oversight over the executive officials of the sector regulator. This is particularly concerning given the highly concentrated nature of the market agency market, with few firms controlling a substantial share of fresh produce trade. Furthermore, that the lack of adequate rotation of fresh produce members on APEC excludes SME and or HDP representation. We have a recommendation for this. DALRAT should, as part of the current legislative amendments concerning agricultural Produced Agents Act, review the composition of the APAC members to minimize conflicts of interest on market agents. In addition, amendments should also include rotating the membership of APAC members to include small or 100% HDP-owned market agents. With respect to retailers or retail, the inquiry makes a provisional finding that the lack of transparency in unit pricing distorts competition in that consumers are less able to compare pricing between retailers. It is important that this concern be remedied, as this will allow consumers to compare pricing of differentiated products in store and across the retailers. There is a provisional remedial action that applies to retailers, namely Woolworths, Shoprite, Spar, Food Lovers Market, and Pick n Pay. Retailers should ensure that in addition to unit prices displayed on various fresh produce, that they should also be per kg or gram pricing displayed below the unit prices in their stores. The inquiry also provisionally found that the national retailers market is highly concentrated, with the top 4 retailers commanding a substantial share of the market. Despite the elimination of exclusivity clauses in shopping centers, lease agreements, there's not been any meaningful entry in the retailing space. There is a need to enhance competition in this market, which will likely lead to more price competition between retailers. We have a recommendation for this. The DTIC must set up a fund to assist new entrants in the retailing of fresh fruits and vegetables in shopping centers. So we have a recommendation and a remedial action. The remedial action is directed at South African Property Owners Association and its members and other large owners of retail property. So South African Property Owners Association and large owners of retail property should commit to make available a minimum allocation of retail space to enable effective entry of new entrants, including HDP and SME, as well as emerging challenger retailers for fresh produce in the shopping centers and or malls. In relation to fertilizers, the inquiry makes a provisional finding that South Africa's reliance on imports exposes the fresh produce value chain and the agricultural sector broadly to global price fluctuations, thereby creating uncertainty in the market. Provisional recommendation for this: the DTIC should implement measures to support the local and or domestic fertilizer industry where there is domestic capability. In relation to agrochemicals, the inquiry provisionally finds that the territorial allocation clauses contained in the distribution agreements between Bayer and several of its appointed distributors limits competition between appointed distributors and ultimately limits the farmer's choice. A remedial action to address this is that Bayer should remove the territorial clauses from its distribution agreements with appointed distributors. In relation to seeds, the inquiry found instances of high markups for a company called Stark Iris. In addition, The inquiry also found that in the recent past, prices for certain seeds supplied by this company, namely tomatoes, spinach, and cabbage, experienced high price increases. These are seeds where the company has relatively high market shares. So the remedial action to address this is that Stark Iris should reduce the markups of cabbage, spinach, and tomato seeds to the average of the markup of its entire seeds in category. Because this is a public address, we are not able to go into any detail at the actual levels of these markups. The inquiry further finds that the withdrawal of funding by certain industry associations, such as HotGrow, will have a negative impact on the ability of ARC to deliver on its mandate. This may lead to market distortions in that it makes farmers dependent mostly on the use of protected varieties, and small-scale SME or HDP farmers may be excluded due to affordability. We have three recommendations to address this issue. DALRAT should ensure adequate funding to the ARC to maintain the gene bank. Number two, the Agricultural Input Control, a directorate under DALRAT, should collaborate with private firms in the industry or industry bodies to build capacity at the AIC. And the last one on this issue is DALRAT should ensure that seed companies sponsor new entrants when testing varieties for South African conditions. The inquiry also considered the usage of plant breeders' rights in relation to Simba, a subsidiary of PepsiCo. The inquiry noted an apparent strategy by Simba, who developed its own varieties and discontinue use of a closed variety before expiry of its plant breeders' rights. It seemingly replaces that variety with its new, fully protected variety. This strategy means that access to a variety which will imminently be open may be limited through the removal of the genetic material. The inquiry engaged Simba, which denied that it stops a variety before the expiry of plant breeders' rights. The inquiry considered Simba's submission but remains unconvinced, particularly because as it stands, there is no access to this cultivar, even if farmers may try to obtain it. In light of this, the FPMI makes a provisional finding that Simba's decision to discontinue the FL 2006 variety without making its cultivar available to the ARC, its potato variety FL 2006 gene material for preservation and ensuring that it is available to any member of the public. DALRAT should consider measures to open up access to FL 2006 potato variety. In relation to cooperatives, the inquiry makes a provisional finding that the current role of cooperatives does not enable sufficient support for or benefits to SMEs or HDP farmers. Another concern with cooperatives is that they are not very effective in current form, and there's a need to formalize them by considering independent third-party administrator who manages the co-op on behalf of members, similar to the grocery buying group model. We have a recommendation that DALRAT should develop a single program which leverages existing structures such as co-ops and extension officers to provide support to small-scale farmers in relation to technical advice, marketing, and the benefits of bulk purchasing. The inquiry had also considered the need for a block exemption to support these cooperatives. But as we were finalizing this report, the Department of Trade and Industry published a block exemption for SMEs which exempts them from various prohibitions in the Act, particularly those in Section 4. And this, in our view, is sufficient enough to address the challenges faced by cooperatives. And if they utilize that block exemption, I think some of these challenges would be addressed. We also have looked at the supply development issues from a barriers to entry point of view, and we have a remedial action to retailers, Woolworths, Shoprite, Spar, Pick n Pay, and Food Lovers Market, that they should expand their existing supply development programs in line with the commitments of the master plan, namely a 3% spend of net profit after tax on their SDPs. This is a master plan commitment. Alternatively, an increase in supply development baseline by 10% annually for a period of 5 years. We have also looked at issues of funding, and the inquiry here makes a provisional finding that delays in the implementation of the blended finance scheme disproportionately affects SME and HDP farmers. There is a provisional finding or a recommendation. These are, we have two. These are the last two recommendations we'll read out. The inquiry's provisional recommendation is that DALRAD, Land Bank, and commercial banks should work jointly to fast-track and accelerate the implementation of the blended finance scheme. This blended finance scheme should also cater for costs of agricultural projects feasibility studies, including water licensing and acquisition of land. And the last recommendation is in relation to water issues that we have raised. We have not identified here a significant issue with respect to water access, given the various reforms that we have seen in the Department of Water and Sanitation. So our recommendation really is to encourage the Department of Water and Sanitation to continue with these reforms. So the recommendation is that the Department of Water and Sanitation should continue its efforts to fast-track the licensing regime, including the pre-application phase. That concludes the broader set of the recommendations. Now, these are the following are the immediate dates that are important. We shall publish the provisional report on the inquiry's website later today. This will be the non-confidential version. The confidential version will also be available, but there are some established mechanisms on how that is accessed by affected parties. Stakeholders have 4 weeks until 16 July 2024 to provide comments on the provisional report, its provisional findings, and provisional remedial actions and recommendations. I wish to thank all stakeholders for their continued support and participation in the inquiry process. I further wish to encourage stakeholders to constructively engage the provisional report and the associated remedial actions and recommendations. The inquiry's technical team remains available to attend to any stakeholder queries. Let me take this opportunity to thank everyone who made it for this announcement today, and thank you very much. Support. This brings us to a close. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair of the inquiry. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I think the next item on our agenda is to field questions, answers, and clarifications, both to people who are in this room and further to people who are following us on our link, streaming. I will, at some point, hand over to Susan to check whether or not there are people at home or wherever they are watching in the offices who may have questions. And further, we'll take a few questions. The technical team is here to field your questions. And further, if there are other questions following this press conference, those questions can be directed to Susan, and we'll be able to field those one-on-one interviews after this, but also various stations that need interviews. Susan will be coordinating those for us. So without further ado, if there are any questions here, we'll take a few, see whether or not we have enough, and we may cross to those who are joining us on the link. But for now, let's start with those who are in the room to check whether or not we have some question. I see Nick's hand is up. There's 2 hands already. I think let's take these 2 questions, and once we are done and there are no follow-ups, and then we'll go to Susan to read us any questions that may be available online. Thank you. Over to you, Nick.
So good afternoon, Nick Wilson from News 24. I just wanted to ask you, obviously I've listened with interest about the retailers. So you're saying, obviously, since that exclusive lease arrangements were sort of basically outlawed, you're saying there have been no newcomers to obviously shopping centres. They haven't been able to get in anyway. Do you believe, like, you talk about, and also this lack of transparency with pricing of fruit and vegetables. I just want to clarify that as well. That is, you said there's no per kilogram. They only do it per unit, so you can't compare between supermarkets as a consumer. Is that the issue? So what I wanted to ask you, I mean, how complicit are retailers in all of this? Are they keeping out the previously disadvantaged individuals, or is it just sort of the market dynamics? And then I also heard you mention the property guys, that they basically will have to start ensuring that a certain percentage, I wanted to clarify what that was, of their shopping centres were dedicated to previously disadvantaged or I suppose black-owned sort of retailers. Thank you.
Hi, Carolise Janssen from Fresh Plaza. I have 3 questions. The first concerns the project of corporatization of the national fresh produce markets. How would that look? You mentioned a board of directors. Where would that be situated, and who would be on those boards? The second question is the divestment of African Rainbow Capital from either Subtropico or the RSA Group. And what would the enforcement mechanisms be? Are they obliged to do it, or is this, strongly recommended? And thirdly, so this inquiry, did this also look at retail prices for fresh produce and whether it follows the seasonal supply and demand, because prices ought to be quite volatile or sensitive to these changes?
Doza from Newsroom Africa. I'll just add to my colleague's question around enforcement. You go out to the big farms and you see that stockpiling issue. You go to the small-scale farmers.
But that space is not available. In our recommendation, we are not yet prescribing the minimum space, right? So this is a subject of further engagement with property owners. I think Food Lovers had mentioned minimum space of 2,000 square meters as a reasonable space you need to have an operation like theirs. But that is something that we will be engaging the property owners. We have started the engagement. We did share with them this preliminary findings, and we are still hoping that there will be a constructive engagement on this. On transparency questions, these are quite important, because what we are picking up, and it's not just in South Africa, even in developed markets, this is a challenge, that consumers find it very difficult to compare prices. Whether this is a scheme of existing players, we will not know. But what we are saying is that consumers should be able to compare prices from retailer 1 to retailer 2 with ease. Right now, they are faced with unit prices. They have to now work this back and figure out, how much is this per kg? Am I overpaying in this retail shop, or am I paying less there? That is just cumbersome to consumers. And when we put this to retailers, and I must say this here now, retailers are opposed to this, right? We are imposing this on them because they say it's going to be costly to do this. We are not convinced by that argument. This is a provisional report. We are issuing this. We think transparency will take us a long way in ensuring that the markets are competitive. Because as we have seen, it's not easy to say this retailer or that retailer is more expensive on tomato, the other one is more expensive on potatoes. They differ at different times. So that's the issue on the transparency issue. I will leave the other question, I think, for my team to deal with. And then on the ARC issue, or rather the African Rainbow Capital. This issue, we have raised it, and this is a very important issue because, unfortunately, I cannot tell you, but what I can say to you is that the top 4 market agents in South Africa account in all of these markets about 90% of the market. Now, when you have a single shareholder, holding stakes into these large market agents, it is a concern for us because we think that reduces competition. And you're asking an important question. What do these remedies mean? With respect to a divestiture, there's a process in the tribunal, in the Act, that we will engage with the company. If then this becomes the final remedial action, when we publish the final report, the process is that must be referred to the competition tribunal. That's just specific to divestitures, because these are confirmed eventually by the competition appeal court. So it can be a very long process, but it has to be a transparent process because it does engage, the rights, I suppose, property rights of businesses. And on retail prices, we have looked at this, and as I've said, we have made some preliminary observations on prices, that there are instances where there are high markups, right, across all these major retailers. And we have engaged the retailers, and where we are now is that there is no common understanding on the cost measures. And we thought we will not release this part, with this provisional report, because there are many other issues that we needed to deal with in this provisional report. We will continue to engage the retailers so that we can reach finality on this matter. it could well be that the high markups are explained by the kinds of costs that the retailers incur, or they are not explained, but we have not finalized that aspect of the inquiry, and we have allowed for further engagements with the retailers. Right. Where we are on the, so these issues that you are raising about, do these speak to other initiatives elsewhere, other regulatory initiatives or policy initiatives? What has been quite, it's been a concern of sort, because we had thought that some of the commitments in the social pacts were commitments that the companies had agreed to. Now, when we find a distortion, we say, let's look at supply development as an issue. Retailers have committed to that in the agricultural master plan. But when we raise this with them, it becomes now a new issue. Now we have to revisit it afresh ourselves, unfortunately, and then make the appropriate recommendations. That's why we are putting out the options to say you can increase this, level of 10%, or you follow what is in the master plan. And you are right, ideally, we should be seeing some connection with the existing measures. And where we are able to find those synergies, as the inquiry, we've attempted to do that. Likewise, with access by small farmers to the national fresh produce markets. The number has been 1% access for years. And the agents have said to this inquiry, we should recommend a 30% allocation. But that is a historical number. When we look at the master plan, it's looking at a very, very low number. And we are trying to align with that kind of reality. So this is how we have settled with some of the recommendations. And you're right, I think it will be this coordination, policy coordination is also very important in all of this, because some of the distortions, as we've said, are due to policy gaps. Some of the distortions you are seeing are due to conduct by firms and so forth. So this is how we have assessed this. But I've left, I think, 2 questions for my colleagues. They'll take one each. You decide which one you take.
Thank you, Chair. So, I mean, I'm happy to take the corporatization question. I think that's fairly decent. Maybe I can have a shot at the property as well, and then if my colleague has additions as well, welcome to add. In terms of what corporatization would be, just for context, that we're saying that where these models aren't employed, they are due to inefficiency. What we're saying is what all of those inefficiencies is to either model, or then to say, okay, go into a public-private partnership, triple P. So either of those would be sufficient. What we understand with corporatization is very similar to what the Johannesburg market already has in place. So they follow a corporatization model where the business as such of the NFPM is transformed into a state-owned company. And by means of that, it has a separate board that is not part of the municipal council, for example. It's no municipal managers that take decisions for the NFPMs. This would be a separate board with a separate budget, with separate procurement lines, and separate accountability. Of course, what is important there is also that the board be stable. And I think it's our report highlights some of the issues that has been at Joburg is board instability, and that contributes to the problem. So corporatization works if there is sort of these provisions, these prerequisites. So I think that's what we mean with corporatization. The second question on clarity about what do we mean with the property owners, I think to clarify or to add what the chairperson has said as well, there's no specific numbers that we're considering at this point. We're not enforcing minimum retail per square meters, for example, on either retailers or property owners. But the property owners have to be part of this conversation because they are the landlords. They own the property, the square meterage, which has to go to new entrants. And I think for clarity, that is why we want to bring them into the conversation. They're already sort of part of this. We have engaged with them, but whatever remedy comes out of this, they have to be part of that. Mahad, do you have something to add?
No, it's fine.
Thank you. We'll go to Susan. Susan has a question or two. It's from either WhatsApp or YouTube. Actually, we do the next question.
Thank you so much. I have a question from Lise from Mail and Guardian. She asked the chairperson to please explain a little bit more about how Simba stops the public or growers from having access to particular potato cultivars and why it is doing this. That's the only question at the moment. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. As I've said, this relates to a potato variety, is FL 2006. FL 2006. What we found is that in this particular instance, as you know, there are plant breeders' rights that protect the intellectual property of any variety that a company may produce. Now, in this particular instance, what we found is that before the rights expire, in this case around about 5 years before, the company stops producing its product using that variety. For that period, that variety is protected. And we understand that with these varieties, the moment you stop producing, you are not able to reproduce in future. So you need to even keep the genes and everything. So all of that is not kept, and the variety dies. It's natural death. So when the rights eventually expire, there is no more variety available to either any new entrant who wants to produce chips or all of this. Right. So this is a challenge, and we have raised this with Simba, and we insist that there should be these recommendations that we have put up. But I don't know, Ruan, maybe.
Yeah, Chair, I think that really covers the gist. I think perhaps for clarity is, I mean, once a variety stops being protected, it should theoretically be available. The genetic material no longer has intellectual property protection, and what we're saying is this is a strategy to prevent it, after it becomes an open variety, to be used by competitors or new entrants. And of course, that is what we're saying is anti-competitive and a problem and distorts competition in this sense. Thank you, Chair.
So they just continue, sorry, to understand how that works. So in Simba's case, in particular, because that's actually PepsiCo, because PepsiCo owns Simba. Mm-hmm. So basically what they decide then, is this, do I understand this, is that they've decided they're not going to use this variety of potato, but they're still trying to keep the genetic sort of intellectual sort of rights. And this prevents other would-be potato chip producers coming into the market. Am I understanding that correctly?
After, yes, after the plant breeder's right expires, and it should be open and freely and available, but because Simba has stopped using that variety, the genetic material has died off, and there's no availability of that variety, even after it becomes an open variety. So new entrants, competitors can't access that variety because the genetic material is no longer available. And what we're saying is that Simba's strategy is to do that before expiry, about 5 years before the plant breeder's rights expires. While it's still protected, while it's still legally protected, it engages in this strategy. And then after 5 years, then the variety has died off. They've switched to a new, fully protected variety that no one can access. So the concern is not the new varieties, the concern is those products.
Thank you, Ruan. If we have more questions, if we don't, we will now close. I see from Susan from online, there are no further questions. Without further questions, therefore, ladies and gentlemen, we'll take one-on-ones after this if there are any. And as I said earlier, the material will be available soon on our platforms, including our website, including the remarks that were made by the chairperson, the press release, and all the other relevant material relevant to this press conference. And as I said, we are available on the WhatsApp group. We are available on email if there are people who want to be in touch with us. And Susan will be coordinating all those interviews subsequent to this event. And ladies and gentlemen, once again, thank you very much for always heeding our call and coming to our events, and we really appreciate it. Thank you very much.